But really, in my opinion, it's an appeal or a reflection back to us at the end of the day. It's not that it's necessarily authentic, and I don't think that one group can like own authenticity. I think authenticity, especially within specialty coffee, is ultimately an appeal to authority.
Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Mapper Forward, friends. I'm your host, Lee Safar. This is sadly the last episode of a 5-part series, which has been a very, very interesting conversation. I love these kinds of conversations where we're talking about the deep nuance in a subject, and our subject is tasting coffee. And in the last episode, we were talking about the power dynamics in play when it comes to taste and how it impacts the supply chain. And we talked predominantly about the producing end of the supply chain. There is a second part of that, because in this episode, to wrap up this series, we're talking about how can we reimagine taste in coffee. Now, Kosta, when we look at how we're reimagining things, help us before we get there understand where this power dynamic exists on the consuming end of the supply chain.
Yeah, it's I think more or less it still exists with the same people.
Okay.
It's the tastemakers in the middle predominantly. I think if I think of like in political economic terms, it's roasters who end up controlling the market. And the way that that is structurally put together is by having like an oversupply of coffee. That's an oversupply of commercial coffee, and I think that's an oversupply of just specialty coffee in general.
Mm-hmm.
Me working, for Algrano, for example, or even like my previous employer, I'm one of 100 green sellers for every green buyer there is.
Mm-hmm.
And it really gives a lot of control, for green buyers to basically pick and choose, who they want to work with. Most green buyers get to choose, the type of coffee they want, when they want it, how they want it, where they want it, just about any time that they want it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in the same way, they're the ones who end up getting to basically control, defining what is good to the consumer and what isn't good to the consumer, and how they should consume that coffee and how they shouldn't consume that coffee.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly there can be a power play, between, the consumer and the roaster. Um, and it can ebb and flow in the same way like it can ebb and flow between producers and roasters, or producers and intermediaries in general.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, we're still looking at tastemakers more or less being able to define what quality is and what quality isn't.
I got into an Uber yesterday, and the driver said to me, what do you do? And I told him I was in coffee, and he said to me, I got an interesting story. I never used to drink coffee. I'm a tea drinker. He said, but now I drink a coffee every day. I'm like, how did that happen? This is like market research for me, trying to understand what people do in the market and what helps them make buying decisions around coffee. Yeah. And he said, I picked up a passenger one day and she asked me to drive to a 7-Eleven. She had to get her coffee on the way to work. So she bought a coffee and she bought one for me. Mm. And he said, and it was amazing. So I went back and bought another one the next day. And I was so angry with her because this was starting to become a habit. Mm-hmm. And he said, now I buy one every day. I'm like, what do you drink? And he said, a cappuccino with 4 sugars. Mm-hmm. I said to him, why don't you buy that coffee in a cafe? It would be a much more enjoyable experience. Then you'd get to meet the barista and have conversations with the barista. And if you go to a special cafe every time, you build a community. And he said, they judge me for the 4 sugars.
Yeah.
Now the whole thing around taste and power on the consuming end becomes about a completely separate commodity than the coffee itself.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a fun paper that I like. It's on taste and more like consumer focused. It's called bivalent class indexing.
Okay. I don't understand what any of those words mean.
I will break it down. Yeah. So it's from a sociolinguist, and it's basically this idea of building words in order to try to basically build a bridge between two different value systems.
Okay.
Um, and so within specialty coffee, it occupies values based like two very uncomfortable situations. One which is like fine taste, and the other is progressive values. And
Okay.
so, like, fine taste is historically been synonymous with aristocracy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's upper middle class, 1% type shit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but at the same time, it has this juxtaposition of wanting to champion for the little guy.
Mm.
And the way that it makes this very uncomfortable negotiation is an appeal to authenticity. This is how you're supposed to drink it. And then
Mm.
there's a book by Amanda Lucia, which is it's titled White Utopias, and it's about festivals like Burning Man.
Mm.
And it's a study of why are all these white people getting involved in practices that tend to be around like the global south or by indigenous peoples. And they also use appeal to authenticity. This is how you authentically practice, this practice. And she breaks down that authenticity is, it basically derives from the idea of authority or power. It's the ability for one group of people to say, this is the correct way to do this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's essentially, what we're doing within specialty coffee. We're appealing to this idea of authenticity, either through and through, in my opinion, using scientific language, through using measurements, through using words like objectivity. And these are ways to go ahead and appeal to like the authenticity of drinking coffee, the best way to drink coffee, the way that we want to consume coffee or grow coffee or process coffee or roast coffee. But really, in my opinion, it's an appeal or a reflection back to us at the end of the day. It's not that it's necessarily authentic, and I don't think that one group can like own authenticity. I think authenticity, especially within specialty coffee, is ultimately an appeal to authority.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Mapper Forward's first on-demand workshop, How to Become a Coffee Consultant, available now online for you to learn at your own pace with a certificate available upon completion. Click the link in the show notes to access today for just €50.
And like when you have either producers or those like coming from the working class, what you end up doing is completely obfuscating and then putting them to the wayside and say like, well, they just don't understand how to drink coffee. And really, what they're ignoring is like, I don't want to be told what to do. And I don't know, that type of rejection I think is honestly quite inspiring.
It's an interesting power dynamic because at the end of the day, the person who owns the business that's selling to the consumer, they get to do whatever the fuck they want, whether the producer wants it or not. Right? Like that's the ultimate power in inverted commas. That's where it sits. What I think is an interesting power play is the way that 7-Eleven approaches this versus the way that specialty coffee approaches this. 7-Eleven, I continue to ask that Uber driver more questions. He said, then it went around price. So the relationship between price and taste. So here's this guy that has decided, he's like, I need to add 4 sugars because the coffee doesn't taste any good on its own. And it's $1.99. And it makes me feel good.
Yeah.
If I buy it in a cafe, I'm going to spend more money. They're going to judge me because it's got sugar in it. And on top of that, I have to listen to them talk to me about stuff that I don't want to have to listen to them talk to me about. Now, all of a sudden, you're starting to realize that the power dynamic around people's purchasing decisions has very little to do with the taste of the coffee. It's the relationship that they have to the cup that they've and the experience that they're having of this thing.
Yeah, right.
Which then makes you wonder, like, what role does taste play in our industry?
Yeah.
And are we as an industry putting too much emphasis on the role that taste plays and not enough emphasis on the experience that's being had by the end consumer?
Yeah, and I would almost put it this way, like what we've tried to focus on is what taste is, and I think ultimately, it's not what taste is, it's what taste does. Taste is a performance, taste is a choreography. You know, taste is, not universal. It can have class elements to it. It can certainly have cultural elements to it. And to
Mm-hmm.
your Uber driver, it wasn't tasteful. Like we have attempted to basically say that like taste is this one thing. It's the commodity itself. That's what
Mm.
quality is. We don't think of quality in terms of expediency or, ease of use. In certain classes, or in certain cultures, like that could mean quality. And, if I go ahead and borrow like David Graeber's idea, of what like a commodity is, like what a commodity is, in my opinion, is it's a secondary process. And ultimately, what we're producing and reproducing are social relations, the types of people that we want to have around. And if I look at specialty coffee, it makes me question what type of people do we want to have around us? And, that goes on the consuming end, but that also goes on the producing end. And what I see over and over again is that we want producers to be poor. We want to teach producers how to taste. And in the same way, I think that's the type of consumer that we want. We want someone who kind of wants to be talked down to in a way. We want them to be wealthy enough. And we want them to like look and feel and act like us. And so it just makes me question, if we think of taste as a performance, what are different ways that we could imagine different performances? It doesn't have to be this way. Like, I think we're just making up life as it is. And if that's the case, then like, what are different ways to go ahead and either push back on it or, imagine new ways?
I To push back on that a little bit, I think what it sounds like you're saying is that we're looking, well, there's the opportunity to look at this as commerce and capitalism. And there's this other element to this, which is the real life artisan and agricultural aspect, the romance side of this. And what is the ratio of commerce capitalism to agriculture romance? And perhaps that dance is being done differently based on which industry, in inverted commas, you're in and what part of the supply chain that you're in. And perhaps the producer would like to see a little more. This is a question. This
Sure.
is not a statement. Perhaps, and what I'm wondering is, do you believe that the producer would benefit more from a little more romance being sprinkled onto it and less commerce? And
Yeah.
is that what you're saying?
No, 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 no. And I do think that like, life is made up of values and we're constantly juggling, which values are more important in which context.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and certainly I think there's been a realignment of values when it comes to purchasing coffees, pre and post pandemic. Like
Mm-hmm.
my experience, if we think of values around like price is one value, commerce, that could be a value system in
Mm-hmm.
itself. Quality or taste could be, a value system in itself. Transparency could be a value system in itself.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on what life or structures are demanding of us, we tend to like try to rearrange those values on like
Mm-hmm.
what's most important at the end of the day.
Mm.
I would certainly not argue, producers need to look more like people in the global north and be artisans, um, like at all. I
Mm-hmm.
think at the end of the day, like they should just have the dignity, of like they produced something, they worked hard, and they should get paid fairly for it.
Right.
Um, you know,
And
like
what I'm saying is that, is there the disrespect? Is there the potential that the factual kind of, or the kind of sterile commerce approach to what they do, the offensive part of this?
mm, no, I don't know. I don't think it's the like. I mean, commerce could be insulting, yeah, as much as I think taste can be insulting.
Right.
Um, yeah, so to me, it's more around ideas of dignity, quality, and consensus making. When we're
Mm-hmm.
when we're talking about, trying to make taste objective, or even economic subjective. In my opinion, we could do it a few different ways. Like we could do it hierarchical. We could
Mm-hmm.
have experts tell us what things should be or shouldn't be. But, maybe another way to do it is around consensus making. What do like we're coming around the same thing, such as coffee. What if producers had the ability to go ahead and define for themselves, what they think that it is, along with roasters? Can they both cup at the cupping table? And for example, instead of it being silent, both of them are talking at the same time. Or, maybe a roaster ends up using, the indigenous produce, like fruits, vegetables, and botanicals of like that region to go ahead and to describe their coffee back to like where they live. Um,
What do you think the practical application of those
yeah,
suggestions would be?
yeah. So this is a great one. So thankfully, coffee is a roaster that worked with El Grano this year with a producer out of Guatemala,
Mm-hmm.
Apollo. And there was a conversation that ended up happening on Instagram um, with a friend of mine. Her name is Camila, and please forgive me, Camila. I forgot your last name. Don't hurt me. And she basically she had this really thoughtful post about like why don't people in the global north end up using descriptors that are found in the global south, or if producers are using descriptors found in the global south, why isn't it considered just as valid or useful? And so Alex from Thankfully ended up asking this question, hey, I own a small roaster retailer, what can I do? And Camila ended up making the suggestion of like, just tell them what the producers think of the coffee. And what he ended up doing online is basically creating two lines, what they think of the coffee and then what the producers think of the coffee. And to me, I feel like that pays an homage, to the producers themselves. And it also says that like different cultures and different people can taste the same coffee and come to different, conclusions. And it's also still worthwhile to go ahead and serve. Not one actor gets to simply own what something is or isn't at the end of the day. And to me, that could be an example of sharing power, between a producer and roaster.
What happens if they're not roasting the same?
Oh man. Like the producer and the roaster?
So, what happens if the roaster is roasting a super dark roast because that's what their consumers like, and the producer is roasting light roast?
Yeah. I don't know if it makes a difference at the end of the day,
What,
and not to say that
I
there
mean, the
shouldn't be a
flavor
difference
profile is going to be
between.
completely different.
Sure. But I mean, this is what I'm trying to say. I could send the same coffee with the same roast profile to 12 different roasters and get 10 different answers. And
Right,
I've experienced that on like a daily basis.
right,
None of them are wrong at the end of the day. And I
right.
accept their realities as it is. And so I think what I'm trying to say here is, like in the same way, even if we have the same coffee, it's likely that we're going to end up tasting different things.
Mm-hmm.
And to attempt to qualify it, based off of like a light roast or a dark roast, yeah, there's going to be different experiences with it. Like, no question about it. To
Mm.
me, it's more of a question of, are we willing to accept people's differences? Or are we going to say that like one group of people gets to define something for everyone else?
What a perfect place to end this series. Thank you so much for a
Thank
really
you.
interesting and engaging conversation. Let people know, where can they find you?
Yeah, Instagram, my handle is Espresso Patronus. I'm also the US sales manager for El Grano. So you
Mm-hmm.
can find me on El Grano's page. And my email is costa@algrano.com.
Beautiful. Seriously, thank you. This was a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Likewise.
Thank you. We sign off every episode with peace, love, and peanut butter. Would you sign this episode, our final episode of the series, off for everybody?
Yeah. Peace, love, and peanut butter.
Have an amazing rest of your day, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, friends. If you enjoyed this video, here's what you should check out next. Consider supporting Map It Forward on Patreon and be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell before you leave.